to resolve some political issues.
Tonight I wanted to spend a few moments addressing recent events in the nation of Venezuela, but before I do, I want to take the opportunity to congratulate the presiding officer, my colleague from the great state of Florida, who a few moments ago, I believe, gave his first speech on the floor of the Senate, and did part of it in Spanish and did it very well, and spoke about the important issues of Puerto Rico, and his leadership here on that's going to be critical. It's an issue I know he knows very well from his time as the governor of our state. And so, and I know this is another cause that he cares about, and he took leadership on it as the governor of the state of Florida, and as recently as 2 nights ago, was with me and some others. Together, we met with the President of the United States to talk about what's happening in Venezuela. The most important answer that we have to have the American people is, why should it matter to us? Why should America even be involved in this? Beyond expressing an opinion or sending a letter or even a vote at an international organism, why should America lead, and why should America be so intricately involved in something going on in another country? And that's always a valid question. It's the most important question we have to consistently answer and not take for granted. I think we don't do that enough anymore in American foreign policy. And it has allowed some to argue that perhaps the United States gets too engaged around the world. We are a nation that should always stand for our principles, and we should defend them, and we should stand with those around the world who share the principles of human liberty and dignity and freedom and respect for human rights. But when the United States gets deeply involved in something in another country, it must also be in our national interest. And so the only reason why being involved on the issues that are going on in Venezuela could be justified to the men and women of this nation for whom we work is to prove to them and argue to them and convince them that what is happening there is not just about Venezuela, but it is in the national interest of the United States. Before I can do that, I have to kind of lay out the history of what brings us to this point. And I won't go into great detail because the time does not permit it. But Venezuela has a constitution. In fact, it has a constitution that was put in place during the rule of Hugo Chavez, someone who I was certainly not a fan of and who was not a fan of the United States. But under that constitution, there was a parliamentary body, the National Assembly, and there was a presidency, and there was a Supreme Court. And what happened a few years ago is that when Chavez dies and Nicolás Maduro, the current dictator of the country, takes over, he has to stand for election. And before he stood for election, there was an election to the National Assembly. And the party that was Hugo Chavez's party and now Maduro's party was trounced. They lost badly. They didn't just lose the National Assembly, they lost governor seats across the country. And Maduro realized that his party and he himself could not survive in a truly democratic system. And so what he did is he canceled the National Assembly. First, he just started ignoring them. He stopped following their orders. They'd pass a bill and he just wouldn't implement it, just completely ignore it, as if they didn't exist. And then he replaced the Supreme Court with hand-picked people that would do what he wanted to do. So the equivalent would be if the President of the United States decided that no matter what law we passed, even if we overrode a veto, he just wouldn't implement it. He just refused to do it. And then at some point, he actually tried to create an alternative to the National Assembly. He created out of thin air this thing called the Constituent Assembly, which is an idea he got from the Cubans and from communist countries, and gave them extraordinary powers to do all sorts of things. And one of the things that Constituent Assembly did is they created an election late last spring. Now, people would say Maduro stood for election and he won, theoretically, at least that's their argument, but it wasn't. You can have an election and it not be a real election. For example, every one of the media outlets in the country is controlled by the government. All of them have to run by law. They're mandated to provide what they call network coverage across the board anytime he speaks to the nation. The opposition party doesn't have that same opportunity. He manipulated vote tallies, and they are able to go in and make sure votes are counted in a certain way. They control votes through the food program. 42% of the people in Venezuela depend on a food program run by the government. To have that food program, you have to have an identification card. When you go vote, that same identification card doesn't just register whether you voted or not. They know who you voted for. They know who you voted for. And so if you didn't show up to vote and you didn't vote for who they wanted you to vote for, meaning Maduro, you got cut off from your food program. And if you had to choose between voting for someone you didn't like and not feeding your family, you're going to vote for someone you didn't like. But despite all that, the turnouts were abysmally low. The images that came out, there was like 2 people in line in some cases. Sometimes they caught the same 5 people making the line over and over again. It wasn't a real election. By the way, he legally disqualified every credible opponent he could have possibly had. And because it was a fake election, the opposition boycotted it. So he didn't even have real opposition. So he wins this fake election, and then comes January, he tries to be sworn in, and he does through this ceremony, but it's not legitimate. It would be the same as if the President of the United States announced that he's calling new elections not in 2020, we're going to have them in April of this year. And if he wins, he's going to get to serve 6 years instead of 4. And everybody here would say, well, that's not the Constitution. It's not a constitutional election. That's what they did. So it's not a real election. And under the Constitution of Venezuela, because that was not legitimate, you have a vacancy in the office of the presidency. And under the Constitution of Venezuela, similar to ours, when there is a vacancy in the presidency, and by virtue of that, the vice presidency, because it was elected alongside, the president of the country becomes the equivalent of our Speaker of the House. The same line of succession we have here. Becomes the president of the National Assembly. And the president of the National Assembly assumes that charge as interim president, and within 45 days has to call valid constitutional elections. And that's what happened yesterday. The valid president of the National Assembly assumed the responsibility of interim president. And now within the next 45 days, he will have to schedule and call for elections. Now, the United States responded to that by stating the obvious. This is not constitutional. It's not legitimate. We don't recognize this fake president. We recognize your Constitution and the president that the Constitution says is in place, this interim president. This is not a guy who's trying to be president himself for 6 years. This is not a fight between 2 political parties, not some civil war like we see in other parts of the world between 2 competing bands. This is basically the person who has been elected, the president of the National Assembly, assuming an interim position, who is now a caretaker to guide the country back towards constitutional democracy. And the United States recognized it, and it is stunning to see some of the reporting on this here and around the world, that he basically proclaimed himself the president. No, he just assumed his constitutional responsibility. That the United States did something unusual in recognizing him. Number one, it's not unusual, it's the Constitution of Venezuela. And number two, it wasn't just the United States. We were immediately joined by 11 countries in the region. That number is now up to 16. In the Western Hemisphere, Colombia, Chile, Peru, Brazil, Argentina, Honduras, Guatemala, all of them lined up and reflected the exact same position that the United States has taken on this issue. So did France. Apparently, so did the United Kingdom today, and Albania, and Kosovo, and a growing number of countries. Even the European Union says Maduro's illegitimate. They haven't gone as far as to recognize the interim president as the interim president, but they have said he's illegitimate and that the National Assembly is legitimate. So it's not unusual. It happens to be the global norm. Who disagrees with us on this other than Maduro? Cuba, Turkey, Russia, Iran, Egypt, apparently. What do they have in common? Think about it. These are not democracies, and they have their own interests here at heart. Some might ask, well, how does this guy hold on to power if he's so terrible? Well, number one, he controls access to food. And I can tell you, if you control access to food and medicine, and you threaten people with hunger, you'll have a lot of control. The other thing he's done is he uses migration as a relief valve. It's a very Cuban regime type tactic. It is estimated that over 2.3 million people, basically 1 out of 12 Venezuelans, have left the country since 2015. Think about that. 1/12 of the population has abandoned the country, leaving behind, in many cases, children on their own, leaving behind catastrophe. And so the ability to drive out opponents and people for whom life has become too miserable is a relief valve. The other is just sheer repression. They put people in jail, they kill people, the people die in custody, they shoot them in the streets. That's pretty effective too sometimes. The second thing that keeps them in power is the assistance of the Cuban regime. And every time I mention that, people think, well, you're just obsessed with Cuba, you're from Miami, you're Cuban American. The Cubans, when it comes to intelligence and repression, punch way above their weight. They are experts at repression. And that is what they basically assist them with. Do you know the Cubans basically run the security apparatus of Venezuela? The personal security of Maduro are Cubans, which tells you a lot about how much trust he has in his countrymen. The Cubans provide them basically all of their intelligence collection and the capacity to collect intelligence. They've trained their National Guard on crowd control. By the way, none of this is free. These are not free services. This is a country that is poor and low on resources. The Cubans are probably pulling in $1 billion a year for these services they provide. The other thing people keep mentioning that keeps them in power is the loyalty of military officers. And I know you'll see the picture of all these guys in a country, by the way, where people are starving. Every single one of these military guys is overweight. Somehow, in a starving country, these people are gaining weight. And they have these fancy uniforms on. But let me tell you, these folks are not truly loyal to Maduro. I saw that picture today, and I can tell you for a fact that more than half of the people in that picture at some point in time have expressed serious doubts about Maduro. But they are really limited in what they can do right now. Why? First of all, because all of them every single one of them is compromised. Their loyalty is not ideological and it's not personal. It is bought, it is paid for. Because every single one of them has access to lucrative corruption opportunities. Some of them have been given the opportunity to raid Venezuela's national oil company. And they've made millions, hundreds of millions of dollars by running that company into the ground. Some of them have been given the distribution of consumer goods, watches and phones and consumer articles. They give them these things that you guys go out and sell them in the black market in the street and you take your cut. Others have been allowed to skim off that food program I mentioned that feeds 42% of the people. The military officers get first dibs at some percentage of it, and they get to sell food directly for a profit. Some are participating in currency manipulation. It sounds a lot like an organized crime ring, like one of these old-style mafia families where one guy ran the loan sharking racket, the other guy had the gambling, the other guy had the prostitution, the other guy did the bank heists. That's what this is. These people are loyal because Maduro allows them corruption opportunities. They're also loyal, by the way, because the Cubans are spying on them. The Cuban intelligence agencies quickly pick up on any of these military officers that are being disloyal or expressing doubts, and those guys are arrested. There has been a massive purge of Venezuelan military officers over the last 2 years. I'm talking about dozens of high-ranking military officials either removed from their positions or arrested and are in jail. And it wasn't for corruption, believe me. It was because the Cubans caught them and reported them, and they were wrapped up, and everybody else is watching that and saying, it ain't going to happen to me. That's not really loyalty, that's fear. You could see it in their eyes today. And by the way, they resent the Cubans, these military officers. Imagine for a moment, this is your country, and here comes the smaller country, and their guys run everything and tell you what to do and spy on you and pitch you against each other. But they better be careful about expressing that resentment because the Cubans are listening, and they'll report you. Despite all this, all is not good for the Venezuelan regime. In fact, it's gotten harder and harder every day. Because what's happened with the sanctions that have been imposed on these individuals, it has cut off their ability to steal money and enjoy corruption. And it's cut off the ability to enjoy the money that they've stolen. They can't travel. They can't buy certain things. They have to hide their money. Some of them have had assets seized here and abroad. And that's created resentment, and that's created anger within the inner circle. And so all these people in the inner circle are now upset because they're not making as much money off corruption as they used to make. And they start saying to themselves, maybe we got to get rid of Maduro and get a new godfather or mafia head here. And Maduro finds out about it and he eliminates them. And so the circle gets smaller, which actually works to his benefit because with shrinking resources, the less mouths you have to feed with corruption, the better. There's a real good example of it. There's a guy named Diosdado Cabello, who ostensibly is now the president of this fake constituent assembly. He happens to be a drug lord, deeply involved in narco trafficking. That's, I guess, his part of the corruption deal. That's his take. That's the business line he's been given. But he also wants to be president. He wants to be president, not Maduro. Interestingly enough, this guy Cabello, when Chavez was removed in a coup that lasted just a couple days, 12, 14 years ago, Cabello swore in as president of Venezuela because there was a vacancy using the exact same provision of the Constitution that they now claim is illegitimate. But here's this guy Cabello, who's a drug dealer, a drug lord, a thug, but he wants to be president. He'll never be elected president of Venezuela in a normal election, in a legitimate election. So what's his path to being elected, to becoming president? Well, the first is this Constituent Assembly he's put in charge of. This new thing they created outside the Constitution is so powerful that it has the power to remove Maduro. They could remove Maduro. And this guy hears the whispers. Believe me, these guys are not blind to what's happening. They can see the country's in disarray, the economy's collapsing, there isn't enough money to steal for all of them anymore. And there are people saying to him, hey, why don't you move on this guy? Because this guy's never going to fix this place. And he's thinking about it, and he's thought about it. But he knows the only way he'll ever be president is if he can preserve the outlines of this regime and just get rid of the Godfather and proclaim himself the Godfather, the head of this new criminal syndicate. Or he could just wait till 2024 and run in a rigged election, again, set up under the confines of this regime. So even if he doesn't like Maduro, it's to his benefit that the guy stays there until he's ready to make his move on him, or until 2024, when he could run under this rigged up system. What else is wrong with Venezuela is they're deeply in debt. They have serious problems. These are the things he's hearing about. They owe China about $18 billion, which they don't have the money to pay. They owe Russia about $3 or $4 billion. You know how they're paying that right now? With oil. They are sending oil to China and to Russia with pennies on the dollar. That's what they're making, because they don't have cash. So they're bartering it instead, paying their debts off in oil. Now, I know you've seen the public pronouncements. The Chinese just want to get paid. They're owed $18 billion, and they want to get paid, and they want to make sure that Maduro is in power, or whoever is in power, someone who's going to pay him the $18 billion. But the Russians want to get paid too. Neither one of them believes Maduro is a great leader or happy with him. They just don't know what's going to come after, and they're afraid that whatever comes after is going to say, we don't really owe you this money, it's not legitimate, because it wasn't approved by the National Assembly. And so they'd rather have this guy in place unless it's going to be someone else just like him. But they're not happy. The corruption in the National Oil Company is so horrifying that even the Chinese and the Russians don't like it. That's how bad it is. And that's got to be a pretty high standard. Then there's the mismanagement. They've destroyed this company. Its production has collapsed. I mean, it's not run by oil people. It's run by generals that don't know anything about the business. They've run it into the ground. And they've missed payments. Remember, they're supposed to be delivering oil for payment? They've missed deliveries to the Chinese and to the Russians. They're not happy about it, but what are they going to do? At least they're getting paid something. Russia has another interest, by the way, which leads me now to why we should care about it. First and foremost, I can make to you a very compelling argument, I believe. That's what's happening in Venezuela is a national interest threat to the United States, and even potentially a national security one. Let me just start with this one. Maduro has repeatedly and openly invited the Russians to establish both a naval and an air base in Venezuela. He basically said, here's the land, we'll build it for you, we want you to have your airplanes, we want you to have your naval ships stationed here. Now, most of us serving here, with some exceptions, have never served in Congress, and many people around do not remember a time when foreign military was stationed, an adversary was stationed in our own hemisphere. But that's what Maduro's inviting him to do. Why does Maduro want it? Because he thinks that acts as insurance against ever having an invasion or whatever he thinks is going to happen. Why does Russia want it? They want it because it's leverage against us. They don't like how close we are to them in Europe with our allies in NATO. So this gives them an opportunity to have the equivalent of it in our own hemisphere. And so if you think that having Vladimir Putin is a good thing, having him in our hemisphere, stationed with his military here, is a good thing, well, then I suppose what's happening in Venezuela wouldn't bother you. But the enormous majority of Americans do not want Vladimir's military anywhere in our hemisphere. And that's precisely what will happen if Maduro remains in power. That alone is a national security threat to the United States. But there's more. In their own national territory, the Maduro regime hosts a group called the ELN, which is a terrorist narco organization. In fact, last week, the ELN detonated a bomb at the police academy in Colombia and killed 20 people. You know where they're headquartered? Inside Venezuelan territory, and it is from there where they plot these attacks. You know what else Venezuela does with the ELN from within Venezuelan territory? They help them ship cocaine to the United States of America. Now, I can tell you both of those are national security interests to the United States. The first is that drugs are a threat to this country, and anyone who is helping a drug trafficking organization ship it into our country is a threat to us. So if you don't mind or don't care about cocaine being shipped in growing quantities into the United States, then I guess Maduro and Venezuela is not something that will bother you. But if you do not want to see people around that are helping drug organizations ship cocaine into the United States under the protection of a government, meaning they're giving them controlled airspace, they're protecting their shipments into the U.S. and into Europe, if that troubles you, then Maduro's a problem. One of our best partners in fighting drugs in the hemisphere is Colombia. But Colombia, right now, is being overwhelmed. They don't have enough money to dedicate to the anti-drug cause at a time when the cocaine production, the growth of coca, and the production of cocaine, I should say, in Colombia is at historic levels 3 years running. Where do you think that cocaine is headed? A lot of it's headed to our streets. That will be on top of fentanyl and heroin and all the other problems we have. We are going to have a cocaine crisis in this country because all that cocaine is headed here. Colombia is out there trying to fight against it. But their resources are being drained because they have at this moment at least 1 million, probably 1.2, 1.3 million Venezuelan migrants who have had to leave Venezuela and are now in their territory. Listen, if the United States suddenly absorbed 1 million migrants over a 12 to 18-month period, we would struggle to afford what that would entail. Imagine Colombia, whose economy is a fraction of the size of ours. And that means instead of being able to spend money fighting the drug cartels to prevent them from bringing the drugs here, they've had to dedicate resources to the humanitarian costs of housing over 1 million people and growing. It's not just Colombia, by the way, that's being compromised. Ecuador, about 160,000, 170,000 Venezuelan migrants. Peru, 350,000 Venezuelan migrants. These people are not bad. They're not criticizing the migrants. But these governments, these are not big governments. Some of these governments have budgets smaller than most of our states. They cannot afford this, and it is threatening to collapse their public health system, which means you may not just have a humanitarian catastrophe in Venezuela. We may soon have a growing economic catastrophe in Brazil, in Peru, in Ecuador, and in Colombia. Multiple countries in our hemisphere, and geography matters. That would be a terrible thing if it's happening in Africa or halfway around the world. It would directly impact the lives of Americans and our economy and our well-being because of how close it is to our country in multiple ways. And so if you think that having a humanitarian crisis in multiple countries in our hemisphere, including countries aligned with us in the war against drugs, then you should care about what's happening in Venezuela. So what's the road forward now? Because I hope people have been compelled to at least understand that this is about more than just caring about democracy. That's a big part of it. We do, and I'm proud of it. But it's about more than just that. This is in the national interest of the United States. And we should be proud, not just of the bipartisan support in favor of the interim president and of democracy in Venezuela. We should be proud of the job that the National Security Council, the White House, and the State Department have done. Because unlike 25 or 30 years ago, this wasn't some unilateral American action where we went in there telling everybody what to do. This is international organisms like the OAS. Today, the Secretary of State appeared at the OAS personally to argue the American case. And he was joined by 15 other countries who voted on a resolution agreeing with our principles on this, and their principles. The leadership of these countries under the auspices of the Lima Group has been extraordinary. The U.S. is an equal partner to them in this endeavor. But what's going to happen now is Maduro is probably going to, instead of he being the one that arrests the interim president, he's going to say, I'm going to turn over to the courts and let them decide. Well, he controls the courts. These guys are all cronies. They're also corrupt, by the way, sanctioned by the U.S. government. So he could very well move to try to arrest the interim president, Juan Guaido, which is tonight, tomorrow, the next day, although the eyes of the world are upon him, and the consequences for that would be extraordinary and severe. You're already starting to hear them talk about, let's have negotiations. This is a tactic they have now used repeatedly, and they use it because they know we all like negotiations. Everybody, anytime there's an international crisis, why don't we all just sit down and negotiate our way through this? And ideally, that would be the outcome. But he doesn't really want negotiations. He wants a delay tactic. He's done this now multiple times. There were negotiations from the Vatican, and they gave up. Then the former Prime Minister of Spain was involved in some of these negotiations. Those were a total catastrophe. He's just doing this to buy time. Now he's talking about Mexico and Uruguay being the host of a negotiation. I wouldn't be surprised if soon he says, why doesn't Russia come in and be the interlocutor? How about that for a national security threat and a national interest threat? Having Vladimir Putin brokering political agreements in the Western Hemisphere, Putin would love it. He fancies himself a great global leader. And you're going to see him do that, but it's all an effort to buy time. He has no intention of negotiating anything, because it buys him time to do what? It buys him time for his fake constituent assembly to change the Constitution towards one-party rule, or even potentially to call new flash elections at some point for a new National Assembly under this fraudulent election system he set up. And to many people, they'll say, oh, they had an election, the opposition lost. But it won't be a real election if the candidate people that could win aren't allowed to run, you're not allowed to advertise, you have no access to the media, they control the ballot box, and they extort people with access to food. At some point, I wouldn't be surprised to see him declare a state of emergency. Maybe go out there and trigger some fake incident false flag where agitators go out and commit violence, and he'll say the protesters are out of control, state of emergency. Why would he do that? So he can paralyze the streets, no one can be out there protesting, and if the opposition tries to leave their homes, now he has a pretext to arrest them. But there really is only one way forward, and that is to do everything we can to strengthen the legitimate interim government, and that began today. The interim president, his first request was for humanitarian aid to help bring food and medicine and medical supplies to the people inside Venezuela. The Secretary of State of the United States immediately announced that as an initial step, we are going to provide immediately $20 million. I know they're working through how to deliver that into Venezuela and how to position that so the Venezuelan people have access to it. This is on top of and apart from the aid we're already providing the migrants in Colombia and in other places. That's a good first step. On day one on the job, the interim president, Juan Guaido, made a request of the international community, and America immediately stepped forward, and I believe very shortly, in a matter of days, there will be significant humanitarian aid, food and medicine, awaiting the people of Venezuela, either within their own territory and distributed through the Red Cross or some other non-governmental organization, or just across the border where they can access it. We have to continue to make clear to the elites in that country that there is no future for Maduro, that there is no way that he can hold on, and they need to begin thinking about who their loyalty should be to. The Constitution they swore an allegiance to, the people they live among, or some guy whose future is about to come to an end. I think it's important that the National Guard know that not only should they not repress the people, but they'll be held accountable if they do. And ultimately, I believe this deeply. I know that the generals and all the guys at the press conference with the fancy uniforms have sworn allegiance, although you notice how nervous they were. But I can tell you the rank and file fighters do not. You know why? Because the rank and file soldier and the mid-level officer in the Venezuelan military, they don't have corruption deals. They're going just as hungry as everybody else. They have massive rates of desertion, people just abandoning posts. And when you saw the images yesterday of the hundreds of thousands of people in the streets, you know that many of those soldiers had mothers and fathers and sisters and brothers and loved ones and wives and children in that crowd. And you know who else knows that? The military brass. And I know for a fact that they have significant doubts. In fact, they probably do not even believe that if they ordered the military to act against their own people, that the military would. Because there's no way that these rank-and-file soldiers are going to shoot on their brothers and sisters and mothers and fathers and other loved ones. So we need to step forward and continue with the humanitarian aid. We need to help use the leadership of the United States to put together reconstruction aid. And we need to help the interim president with whatever he needs to be able to carry out a legitimate, free and fair and internationally supervised election, which he should call for in the next 45 days. This is the path forward. It's in our national interest. It's the right thing to do. It reflects our values, but it also reflects our interests as a nation. And that's why this matters. That's why we should care. This is not halfway around the world. This is in our own hemisphere. Just a few hours flight away. And it impacts more than just one country. It impacts an entire hemisphere. And I'll close with this. There's been a lot of criticism historically over the U.S. role in the Western Hemisphere. During the Cold War, the criticism was that we were supporting right-wing dictators fighting off communism, that we were involved in coups, and that we had a heavy hand and got in and imposed ourselves. Then we went the total opposite, and for many, many years, in fact, up until very recently, no one even talked about the Western Hemisphere. And to the extent we did, it was about migration and drugs. It was almost, frankly, a complete abandonment of the portfolio. What you're seeing now is the potential birth of a new Latin America, a new Western Hemisphere, one in which the United States is an important partner, but not a unilateral actor. When you see 16 countries in this hemisphere come together with the economic and diplomatic weight of Peru and Chile and Colombia and Argentina and Brazil, when you see the OAS come alive after years of, frankly, not playing them. When's the last time any of us here even discussed any of the things happening at the OAS? You start to see the beginning of not just a way to confront this crisis in Venezuela, but of a hemispheric partnership whose impetus may have been this crisis, but creates a path forward that's in our national interests. Imagine if, in fact, the democracies and free people of this region came together not just to tackle dictatorships, but to tackle drugs, to tackle the root cause of migration. Imagine a hemispheric 16, 18 regional nation response to what's happening in El Salvador and Honduras and Guatemala that's causing these people to undertake this dangerous journey with their children in many cases. Imagine if it wasn't just the United States, but us working in partnership with all these other countries to tackle these hemispheric challenges. I'll tell you, that's in our national interest. And not only is this an opportunity to do the right thing in Venezuela, it's an opportunity to give the start to a new hemispheric reality, a new Latin American reality that serves the national interests of this country and allows us to live in a hemisphere that is free and prosperous, where people do not have to abandon their homelands, where people can stay in their countries if they so choose and raise their families and not have to undertake dangerous journeys to other countries for fear of their lives. But we have to start somewhere. And I can think of no better place to start than on behalf of the people of Venezuela, who have suffered terribly for far too long under a dictatorial, corrupt regime, who has tortured their children and murdered their fathers and mothers, and denied a once prosperous country the future they deserve. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Recognize the senator.
Mr. President, I come to the floor today to implore my colleagues and the President to end the shutdown and reopen the federal government. We are now on day 34 of this shutdown, which is well past being the longest in American history. You think about what our country has been through: civil war, World War I, World War II. You think about what we had with protests, what we had with the country in the Depression, what we had only a decade ago with the biggest downturn since the Depression. Through all of that, even through a few shutdowns, we somehow, in this chamber and in the House and in the White House, we're somehow able to get our act together, and we're somehow able to keep the government open. Now is the time to open the government, Mr. President. The 800,000 federal employees who are not being paid are keenly aware that this is the longest shutdown in record. Another sad milestone is coming. If the shutdown continues through tomorrow, these workers will miss yet another paycheck. These are workers like a federal prison worker in Rochester, Minnesota, who noted to me that the inmates were getting paid, but the prison workers are not. And she was so excited to get this job a few months ago. Her child was in daycare. She's a single mom. And now she has to decide between taking some other job and moonlighting. What does she do about the daycare? If she takes her child out of daycare and stays home with her child, which would make some sense, except she wouldn't have enough money, then she would lose her spot in the daycare. It's very hard to get daycare in Minnesota. So instead of working on those kinds of what I would call opportunities at a time when our economy has been stable after we've gotten out of the downturn, we have been working out of chaos. So instead of helping her to afford childcare and figuring out smart solutions, or doing something about pharmaceutical prices, or doing something about college costs, or training our workers for the jobs of today and tomorrow, or enacting comprehensive immigration reform. So in my state, in our rural areas where we don't have enough workers on our farms and in our fields and in our factories, we should be working on those opportunity issues. Instead, we're trying to crawl out of chaos. We need to reopen the government and get these workers back on the job, providing vital services for the American people. Once it is open, as my colleagues have made clear, as leadership has made clear, we can continue negotiations with the President about border security. I am someone, as did my colleague from Pennsylvania, we voted for a bill that had over $40 billion in border security that was part of comprehensive immigration reform. We did this. But was it a wall through the entire border? No, it was not. It allowed the experts to decide where there should be technology, where there should be fencing, where there should be barriers, where there should be personnel. That's the way to do this. There is no reason that our federal workers and the American taxpayers who rely on the vital services provided by the federal workers should be held hostage while these policy negotiations take place. The pain that this shutdown is causing is real, and it is getting worse. The administration has implemented many creative measures to try and blunt the public outcry against the shutdown, but these measures are being held together by duct tape. We use duct tape a lot in Minnesota. We try to put things together, but we shouldn't be using duct tape to tape together our entire government. Our agencies are running out of money, and many are reaching the breaking point. Earlier today, the 5 former secretaries for the Department of Homeland Security, including our first DH Secretary, Tom Ridge, and John Kelly, President Trump's former chief of staff, let me say that again, just recently, his chief of staff, wrote a letter urging an end to this shutdown and full funding for the Department of Homeland Security. In their letter, the former secretaries noted that Congress always prioritizes funding of the Defense Department as a matter of national security. Quote, Congress does so because putting national security at risk is an option we simply can't afford. DHS, Department of Homeland Security, should be no different, end quote. While the administration continues to explore ideas like a national emergency declaration to bypass Congress, the irresponsibility of all of this is breathtaking. Yesterday, the presidents of the National Air Traffic Controller Association, the Airline Pilots Association, and the Association of Flight Attendants released a terrifying joint statement pointing out the risks that the shutdown presents to air travel. These leaders state, in our risk-averse industry, well, that is putting it mildly, we cannot even calculate the level of risk currently at play, nor predict the point at which the entire system will break. It is unprecedented. I have talked to the air traffic controllers in my state. I have talked to those TSA workers that sit there every day and do their job without pay. In this letter, they go on to state that the air safety environment is deteriorating by the day. Reading this statement does not give me confidence, nor does the fact that a full 10% of our Transportation Security Administration agents are now missing work because of financial limitations, meaning they can't cover the daycare and transportation expenses required to come to work. Those who can come to work are surely distracted by worries about how they will pay their bills. As a member of the Senate Commerce Committee, I worked with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle last year to reauthorize the Federal Aviation Administration. We were rightly proud of the law, including the third title, simply titled Safety, which had 90 individual provisions designed to maximize the safety of air travel for the American people. We required updated safety training procedures for airline professionals, sought to improve safety on our nation's runways in rural areas, and updated the laws regarding engine safety. This matters a lot in my state. We are a major hub in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area. We are the state that manufactures jets up in Duluth at Cirrus. We are the state that has major Minnesota National Guard facilities that train flight inspectors and aviators and people all over the country. Aviation is incredibly important in my state. In our bill, we required updated safety training procedures for airline professionals, sought to improve safety on our nation's runways and rural areas. As the senator from Pennsylvania and Florida know, rural airlines in our states are key, rural air service, I should say, and we also updated those laws. Yet we are now hearing that the entire system of air travel may break. For what? What does air travel have to do with border security? The short answer is that air travel has nothing to do with border security, except when we are checking our airports and making sure that they're safe when there are border flights. If we are talking about a wall across the southern border, that has nothing to do with our airports in Minnesota and in Pennsylvania and in Florida. I have long favored increasing our border security through smart technology, and as I mentioned, our 2013 immigration bill, which passed this chamber with a number of Republican votes, many of them are still here, that included money for an additional 40,000 Border Patrol agents, and as we know, most drugs come into this country through our ports of entry, and if we want to do something about the various problems with the drugs coming into our country, things like heroin from Central America and from Mexico, and things like other opioids, then we should be doing something about those ports of entry. As has been the case all along, there are proposals on the table that will reopen the government and end this senseless shutdown. The House has now passed legislation that would fund the government under any number of arrangements. This includes bills that fund all remaining government agencies through the end of the fiscal year. Bills that fund individual departments and agencies, most having absolutely nothing to do with this debate that is raging with the White House, or I should say, raging in the White House. This last bill that was passed on February 8th, short-term basis that would have taken us through February 8th, would have allowed the President and Congress to negotiate a longer-term proposal. That was a bill that we passed in the Senate. This last bill was even coupled with additional funding for disaster relief, a priority for both parties that wish to help Americans in states that have suffered through hurricanes and wildfires. Earlier this afternoon, the Senate voted on this short-term funding proposal. While the proposal did not gain the required 60 votes to gain consideration, I was encouraged by the fact that 5 Republican senators joined Democrats in voting to consider this bill. This is progress, and we need to build on that momentum by working together to do the right thing for the American people. On Monday, we celebrated Martin Luther King's life, and one of the things that Martin Luther King once said was, "It is always the right time to do what is right." This is the right time. We can't just keep waiting while government agencies remain shuttered. There are 6,100 federal workers in the state of Minnesota who are not receiving their paychecks. Farmers, small business owners, and taxpayers are going without vital services from their government, major portions of which have been closed for 34 days. It's time to reopen the government. I yield the floor. Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President. I recognize the senator.
Mr. President, I rise to talk about the shutdown as my colleague, the senior senator from Minnesota, just did, and grateful for her comments on what's happening to people in Minnesota, the direct impact, the direct adverse impact of this shutdown on their lives. We've all seen it. We've all experienced it. I'll be referring to specific testimony from people who wrote me letters, but let me just highlight one experience I had the other day at a food bank in central Pennsylvania, just miles from our state capital, a food bank that serves some 27 of our 67 counties. And I was talking about how this shutdown could end, that the president wanted the shutdown, he got the shutdown, but he could also end it. But prior to the discussion we had, behind us was a table where they had an entire table full of food items that food bank and others in that region of Pennsylvania were delivering to federal workers, especially TSA agents, who cannot afford food because they're working but not being paid. Hard to comprehend that so many veterans around the country who are once again serving their country, serving in the government as they served in combat or in the military, serving again yet being left out in the cold, so to speak, sometimes literally, but obviously left out when they don't have a paycheck. So this is real life. We debate bills and budgets and appropriations here in Washington. We have debates on the floor and debates and discussions in the hallways, but for these folks, this is real life. I'll just point to maybe 5 examples in Pennsylvania. Adams County, which is in the southernmost part of our state, where Gettysburg is, just on the Maryland border, but not a big county by population. Here's what one individual said, talking about marrying, this individual's married to a federal worker, and I will just quote her in part. She said, and I quote, "We are expecting our first child this summer, and prior to December 22nd, we're excited about the future and potential of 2019. Now we are anxious, sad, and angry, not knowing where money will come from to buy necessities for this child, let alone medical expenses related to birth and daycare." She goes on to say later in the letter, "We're now in real and serious danger of losing our home and our vehicles. We will soon have to choose between buying groceries or paying for the electric bill." And she goes on from there. One Pennsylvanian in Adams County. Here's one from Cambria County, the county where Johnstown is in the southwestern part of our state. This individual said, "My husband is a federal employee who has been furloughed." She goes on to say, "We have a son in elementary school. It's about time for spring sports signups, but we don't know how we're going to pay our bills or buy groceries. It's our son's birthday in less than 2 weeks. We canceled his birthday party to save some money." Cambria County, Pennsylvania. The third one I'll highlight is from Delaware County, one of the big suburban Philadelphia counties, big population county. Here's in part what this individual said. "My in-laws are selling their home and cannot go to settlement because the FHA will not close a mortgage for the buyer." That's among several things they said. In the interest of time, I won't read all of it. But we hear those stories all the time of people not being able to complete the work on a mortgage because of the impact on the FHA. Here's Montgomery County, also a suburban Philadelphia county. This individual said, "I am a law enforcement park ranger for the National Park Service. I'm the sole provider for a family of 4 to include 2 young children. Not knowing when I will get paid again is putting undue stress on the entire family." That word keeps coming up either directly in these letters or by implication. Stress. Over and over again, the stress that it's putting on, this shutdown's putting on families across America. And the last one, Mr. President, I'll highlight is from Warren County, in the northwestern corner of our state. Much smaller population county than the two suburban Philadelphia counties I just mentioned, Montgomery and Delaware. Here's what this individual said in Warren County. Both my wife and I are federal employees working for the United States Department of Agriculture, Forest Service actually. We're also both veterans. We will be using our savings to live off of and charging food to our credit cards if we must. Mr. President, it goes on. And I know you have seen the same thing. We've all seen and heard much about this. Not enough time tonight to go through every letter, but this is what has to be the priority of all of us, to be responsive to these cries for help, to be responsive to Americans who are just asking us to open the government. Open the government so they can be paid, so they can make ends meet, so they can pay for groceries, so they can pay the mortgage or even have a mortgage in some cases, and also to pay for basic necessities, and sometimes even just paying for a birthday party for their son. Over and over again, we hear these stories. I was encouraged, as my colleague from Minnesota made reference to, that today we had 2 votes. There's a high or a likely expectation prior to the votes that they wouldn't get enough to pass. But at least we were voting. At least we were voting on one measure that one side favored and the other measure that my side of the aisle favored. I was also encouraged that 5 Republicans voted for the Democratic proposal, which is very simple. Fund the government, open the government, and adding disaster assistance for that emergency, the emergency of a natural disaster, the emergency that was in part of the lives of people adversely affected by so many natural disasters. But this is also, of course, an emergency. Funding the government, making sure that those workers have their pay, and making sure those who are served by important programs like the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. And of course, we could make a long list of programs that are important to people's lives. In the case of the so-called SNAP program, what we used to call food stamps, you're talking basically about children, seniors, and people with disabilities. That's most of the people that get benefits from the SNAP program. They are only guaranteed help from that program through February. February. There's no certainty about March. There's no certainty about April or the forthcoming months. That's just one program that serves millions of Americans that already is adversely impacted because of the shutdown. So whether you're talking about a mom or a dad who is a federal employee, or whether you're talking about someone who needs the help of the federal government, people that we have said over many generations deserve that help. In either case, it's unacceptable to them, and it should be unacceptable to us to not have the government open. We've got lots of time to debate many issues after that, but priority one has to be open the government, and then we have a lot of time for debate on a range of issues. Mr. President, I would also ask consent to speak on another topic, but would ask consent that this body of remarks be placed in a different part of the record.
Without objections.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'll conclude tonight with just some brief remarks. We're going to have many or several occasions to amplify these remarks in the coming days regarding the passing of Senator Harris Wofford, senator from Pennsylvania from 1991 to the early days of 1995. And I wanted to just offer some personal remarks. It's very difficult in a short time frame to encapsulate the life of any individual, obviously, but in this case, impossible in a few short minutes to encapsulate the life, the contributions, the achievements of Senator Harris Wofford. But I'll just highlight a few. If you just read his resume, you would think you were reading the life story, the achievements of several people instead of just one. Just give you some highlights. An early advocate for civil rights, someone who stuck his neck out to march with Dr. King, his friend, a good friend, to advocate on behalf of the civil rights law of 1957, the Civil Rights Act, I should say, of 1957, then working for President Kennedy as a special assistant for civil rights, preparing the way for the great breakthroughs of the mid-60s, the civil rights legislation of the 60s. He worked with Sergeant Shriver and others in the Kennedy administration in the formation of the Peace Corps and served in that capacity overseas. As I mentioned, he was a good friend of Dr. Martin Luther King, participated in the Selma to Montgomery civil rights marches in 1965 in support of voting rights for African Americans. He was a president of two colleges, two different colleges, one in Pennsylvania, Bryn Mawr, a great college, one of the best in the country. I got to know Harris Wofford before he was Senator Wofford, when he worked for the new Casey administration, when my father was elected governor of Pennsylvania in 1986 and put together a cabinet in the early part of 1987. He appointed Harris the Secretary of Labor and Industry, one of the big departments in state government, and it was from that position that he was chosen to be the United States Senator after the tragic and untimely death of Senator John Hines. He passed away in April of '91, and Harris was named the next month. He was elected in 1991 to complete that term, then lost his re-election in 1994. But Harris was not done with service. After serving the Kennedy administration, after doing such great work on education and civil rights in the interests of justice, he went on to continue his work after being in the Senate, working very hard to make sure that the Martin Luther King holiday wasn't just a holiday, but a day of service. And he and others came together in the mid-90s, after Harris was out of office, after he left the Senate, to make sure that that day is a day of service. Now, all these years later, more than 20 years later, hundreds of thousands of people across the country perform acts of service, engage in service on that day. We will be spending more time highlighting his life here on the Senate floor and in other places around the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, and I'm sure across the country. But let me just conclude with these words. Harris Wofford was a champion for justice. And in the scriptures, they tell us that we should, those who pursue justice should be blessed. Blessed are they who hunger and thirst for justice, for they shall be satisfied. Harris Wofford was never satisfied when it came to justice. He was always trying to march us forward, always urging us to do more in the interests of justice, the interests of civil rights, equal rights. So he was a champion for justice. That's probably an understatement. He was also a person of uncommon courage to stand up as he did on civil rights when it wasn't easy, when it at times was literally dangerous. But also, in addition to his courage, he was a person of integrity and decency. Always wanted to know what someone else was doing, what their life was like, what they hoped for our country. Always, always curious about other people's lives and what he could learn from them. To say he lived a life of service is again an understatement. I don't know of anyone who served in so many different capacities, whether it was in the Army Air Corps in World War II, whether it was leading the way on civil rights for President Kennedy or whether it was here in the Senate helping to create opportunities for service. He not only lived that life of service, but he challenged all of us, whether we were public officials or citizens. He challenged us to serve. He lived the words of Dr. King, the words of service. Dr. King said, everyone can be great because everyone can serve. Harris Wofford was great for lots of reasons, but he was also great, of course, because he served. So, Mr. President, we're going to have more opportunities to amplify this small measure of commendation to Harris Wofford. But on a night like tonight, we're thinking of him, we're inspired by him, and we're grateful for his service and that of his family. I had a chance to talk to his son, Dan, who's been a friend of mine for a long time, just hours before his father passed away. I was honored to talk to him in those difficult hours. So, Mr. President, in remembering Harris Wofford, as we'll do more formally in the next number of days, I want to thank him for his service to the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania and his service to America. And with that, Mr. President, I would yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
In fact, I didn't even realize this until it was presented to me, but the 115th Congress that we just concluded had more session days than any Congress since 1951. And so that goes to tell you these pages worked incredibly hard, and we're grateful. We hope that their experience here was rewarding. And they should know that there are several members here serving on this side who once sat there. And so we look forward. I shouldn't be here by the time you guys get here, I hope, but we look forward to your service to our country in the years to come and whatever you decide to do. So thank you for all the work that we truly appreciate with the time they've put in. And I would ask unanimous consent, Mr. President, that their names be printed in the record.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to the consideration of Senate Resolution 28 submitted earlier today.
The clerk will report.
Senate Resolution 28, resolution recognizing January 2019 as National Mentoring Month.
Is there objection to proceeding to the measure? Without objection, the Senate will proceed.
I ask unanimous consent the resolution be agreed to, the preamble be agreed to, and that the motions to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Without objection.
I understand that there are 3 bills at the desk, and I ask for their reading in block, their first reading in block.
Without objection, the clerk will report the titles of the bills on block.
H.R. 648, an act making appropriations for the fiscal year ending September 30, 2019, and for other purposes. H.J. Res. 28, making further continuing appropriations for fiscal year 2019 and for other purposes. H.J. Res. 31, making further continuing appropriations for the Department of Homeland Security for fiscal year 2019 and for other purposes.
Mr. President, I now ask for a second reading, and I object to my own request, all in block.
Objection having been heard, the bills will receive their second reading on the next legislative day.
Now, Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that when the Senate completes its business today, it recess until 12 noon Friday, January 25th. Further, that following the prayer and pledge, the time for the 2 leaders be reserved for their use later in the day.
Without objection.
If there is no further business to come before the Senate, I ask that it stand in recess under the previous order.
The Senate stands in recess until noon tomorrow.
Hi everyone, my name's Mike. I'm the creator of Mox News, and for the last 15 years I have been telling you that as long as I have the support of the community that I serve, Mox News will post videos forever. And that's the truth. As long as I have your support, no one could ever make me stop. Unfortunately, currently, less than 1/2 of 1/10 of 1% of Mox News viewers ever donate, tip, or contribute anything back. Again, let me make that really clear. Much less than 1/2 of 1/10 of 1% ever give anything back. And to those of you who have donated to Mox News, I want to thank you so much, because it's because of your generosity that we have been able to bring attention to important videos that millions and millions of eyes would have never seen. And I think that that's an amazing thing that we've been able to make happen together. And I can't thank you enough for helping me make that happen. So it's not too late. If you'd like to see Mox News covering the 2020 presidential election, if you can't imagine the 2020 presidential election without Mox News, please, there's still time. You can make a difference. It's easy to make a contribution, donation, or tip. You can go to moxnews.com, or in the text body of this video, there are clickable links to the Patreon page or to the PayPal page. And again, it should take less than 2 minutes to make a donation, and your donation can make a big difference. So I thank you all. Stay cool. One of these days this war is going to end, and it would be awesome if Mox News could be there to celebrate that day with you.